My mom loves to tell this story about when I was 4. I told her that I had some idea in my head about when you become an adult, you move away from home. And I told my mom that I was going to prepare her because when I was a grown-up, I was going to live in Paris and be a writer. So I think that was like my first moment of being like, I want to write stories. I obviously didn't know how to really write or read at that age, but I do remember drawing like comics a lot at that time. And it's just something that I've always loved. And since that time, basically, I've always tried to write stories. It just took me a while to actually finish a book. My name's Dana, and I am a writer and burlesque dancer. So I started doing burlesque about 10, 11 years ago. Karen, who is also known as Stella Gams, taught us a lot about it. And she said you should know everything about your character down to what her favorite drink is. And so I thought about that a lot and like who our characters would be, but I just took it a step further. So my book is called Girls with Fake Names. It's based in 1927 in Vancouver and Montreal. And it's about a young woman named Jane Weatherall who's trying to escape her family's identity as notorious Vancouver bootleggers. And so she leaves home. She has these plans to move to Paris and start a publishing company. But along the way, she ends up in Montreal and meets a burlesque dancer named Ruby, who she falls in love with. And through this whole whirlwind adventure, she ends up finding herself caught in the middle of a gang war that's between her own family and this woman she's fallen in love with. So she has to choose between protecting her family or this woman. She is 23, and I started writing this book when I was 25. So I was a very shy, naive young woman, which is very much reflected in my character. I think of Jolie, my stage persona, like she started as this sort of timid, coquette kind of character who was like very sweet about what she did. And that shows through the character in my book. There are a couple of parts because my character gets into burlesque and I describe the acts that she's done, and it's the same acts that I've done. One of the other characters is actually, in the beginning, was very loosely based off a friend of mine who's also in burlesque. So there's a little bit of myself as well as my friends in the story. Yeah, so it's been a long time. I originally at the time I was living in Australia and I was just a backpacker, so I had a lot of free time. And so I wanted to spend time doing like creative writing projects where I just start writing and I can't stop until, a certain amount of time has passed. And so I decided to write a story about my persona as a burlesque performer, which is named Jolie Fromage. And when I started that, it was like very 1920s comedic style acts. And so I just started writing about what her life would be like, but I couldn't stop. Like I was just so attached to the story that I just worked on it as much as I could over several weeks. I had no intention for it to turn into a novel, but by the end of it, I had a full story, and it was very rough. It had so many holes, and it's such a different story than it was when I started. But yeah, that's how it all began. I've tried to write other books in the past. I wrote one before that just did not work out because it was so full of holes, but it was like an Alice in Wonderland sort of style story where this character meets all of these like famous artists or like painters, and it's a very odd sort of world. But yeah, it just didn't really work out. And I don't know, I've probably tried a bunch of other stories, but this was the first one that just like kept me and made me want to keep going with it and just figure out where the holes were and work past the frustrating parts. My mom reads everything I write. She's a huge reader and has loved writing herself, and so she's always my like number one editor. And she is really good at finding inconsistencies and typos or whatever, so she will be honest in that way, but is also like, she's my mother, so she tells me everything I do is amazing. So I don't really take her that part of it too seriously, because she has to say that. That's the main person who I would get to read it. And then there's like Facebook groups and of other writers who I would talk to. And there's been a few who have read part of it and have given me their opinion. I've worked with multiple editors because I would think that it's done and then send it to an editor and they'd point out like a couple things and I would suddenly be like, no, this is all trash. I have to start from the beginning. And so, yeah, and I just got to a point in the last couple of years where I was like, I'm just going to do this for the rest of my life if I don't put it out there. So I hired one last editor and I was like, okay, help me make this like as good as it can get. And I'm just going to put it out there at the end of it. I try to jump between things, but I'm not very good at it. Like, I knew that until this first book came out, I wouldn't be able to like fully focus on something else until it was coming out. So yeah, I usually just get like tracked. I'm a one-track kind of person with those projects. I do like other artsy things instead. Like I'll paint sometimes when I'm feeling the creative bug, but like don't have the capacity to actually write. Or make candles or something like that instead. So I'm not diagnosed, but I'm fairly certain I have ADHD. So I get into new hobbies really easily and I become obsessed with them. And I don't even know how candle making started, but I bought like a cheap beginner's pack from Amazon. And I really liked it. And then I started learning more about how to make them and saw all these really beautiful designs. So I started making ones with like flowers or like anatomical hearts and just a bunch of random things. I was really pushing them hard for a few months last year, and I've kind of just, like if people ask me for them, I can sell them, or sometimes I sell them at the 49th Gallery. But yeah, it's just something, usually in the fall, I take a lot of time to make candles and just try and get creative with that. The only thing I haven't gotten into is music, but that's better for everyone. I really need or want to learn how to sew because I love clothing and especially like vintage fashion. And it'd be so easy to make well, not easy, but relatively easy to make some of the things I want to make. But for some reason, that's never been something I was good at. But there's still time. Yeah, like there's just so many outfits from like the 20s or the 40s that I would love to wear, but my shopping habit is very expensive. Then probably like 4 times. I taught English there when I was like 20. So I did sort of get to live out my Paris dream, but that was just for a couple months. But yeah, I really loved it. I lived in this house that used to be a horse stable in the 1900s, and then they renovated it to be a home. And it was a bit outside of Paris. So I had to bike into the city every day, and then I would walk around. And I took a creative writing class at Shakespeare & Co., which is this bookstore that like James Joyce and Hemingway used to go to. So I really got to live out my like writer Paris dream. I think I've always wanted to be like an author first and foremost, but it's not something you can make a career out of. So I decided to get into journalism, and that's what I went to college for in Vancouver. And then right after I finished college was when I moved to Yellowknife and I started working at the newspaper. So I worked there and then did some like communications jobs in between and like freelancing in Yellowknife as well as Vancouver. And then my last job before this one, I was editor of Up Here magazine. So yeah, I was a journalist for like 10 years before I got into communications. That is a little bit to be determined at the moment, but it'll most likely be at Yellowknife Books. I will have copies at my book launch as well that I'll be selling, and I'm working on getting it in other bookstores in Yellowknife as well as Vancouver. I don't want to read because I don't like the sound of my voice. I thought about asking my Johnny to do it, but it's told from a woman's perspective, so that might be a bit jarring, but his British accent always makes everything sound nicer. But yeah, maybe down the road an audiobook would be cool. Yeah, I think, well, I grew up in Vancouver, but everyone like knows it as being sort of a glass city, and it's not particularly artsy or like fun compared to other places in Canada. And so I think when you read Canadian stories, especially historical fiction, they're usually based in Toronto or Montreal. And I discovered so much about Vancouver's history that was really cool. And so it's just sort of like my ode to where I'm from and to be able to share a part of the history that most people don't know about. An important theme of my book is the fact that my main character is bisexual. And I chose that because I'm bi, and I feel like there's a lot of like, when you read books and if someone, you know, is with a man and then later down the road they end up with a woman, then you just assume that that means they're actually a lesbian. And I think that it was really important for me to have a story that highlights like bisexual stories and bisexual love stories. And so yeah, that was really important for me to have that in there. I was really shy starting it and had never done anything performance-wise, so it was a huge step for me to do it. But I found everyone was just so supportive right from the very beginning. And it's such a loving and embracing community that if you want to get into it, there's so many people who will be there behind you and help you learn how to do it. I think Yellowknife is such a creative place, and people are so excited to support other people doing art. I think burlesque for a lot of people is really empowering, and so people sort of like to go to that and support that, and seeing other women or other people find that empowerment through their acts. I've always been confused by that too, like, because when you think of the Yukon, like they're known for having their can-can dancers and that sort of thing, but Yellowknife didn't have that history. So it's weird that 15 or so years ago that suddenly just popped off here. I really love burlesque for that reason. It kind of just feels like another form of storytelling to me. Stella is definitely the mother of burlesque in Yellowknife. She's been doing it for, I think, 20 plus years, and she's always so supportive, and she'll dedicate time to help new people get into it. So she's like really great in that way. Ortiz is one of those people. Like, she's one of my inspirations for burlesque dancers in town. But yeah, I think that anyone who gets into it is really excited to be supporting new performers and whatnot. That's really cool. My act started as 1920s sort of coquette style comedic acts, but it's changed so much over that time, and sometimes I go back to that, but I don't really think I have a style anymore. It's kind of just whatever interests me that month, because I've done a lot of classic burlesque, but I've done like horror and a Twilight act and Marilyn Monroe and just random things. The character in my book, the reason it's based in the 1920s is because I am a bit of a history nerd. Especially for fashion history and art history. And I don't even know what really started that love of the 20s, but I was very much, you know, wanted to live in Paris in the 20s and write alongside Hemingway and Fitzgerald and that sort of thing. I just don't really know what really got me into that, but it was just an era that I loved to fantasize about. And so when I started doing burlesque, that was the sort of persona I wanted to have. So that would be my opportunity to live in the 20s. Like, that's the closest I'd get to it. And so writing this book was sort of just another way to step into that world. Funny thing is that my cousin just came out with a book a few months ago, and she became an instant bestseller. So that's really cool. And so I hope in a way that I can like live up to her reputation as a writer. Wild People Quiet. It's hand it right here. This one? It's based in the 1940s, so it's also a historical fiction about a woman who sort of tries to escape her identity, and she sort of has to come to terms with that. But it's loosely based on my own family history because we're Métis. And so yeah, that book like instantly did really well, and I've been sort of looking up to her lately a lot more, and yeah, hopefully she can read my book too, and then she'll really like it. I like try and recommend it to everyone because I, I mean, I'm biased, but I really do think it's a really great book. My Uncle Ted, my great Uncle Ted, was an English professor, and he wrote a book, but it never got published. He was like a big influence in my life growing up. Like, if there was a book that I wanted to read, he would go and buy copies, not just for me, but for himself as well. And I saw him every Sunday, and we'd always talk about books together. And I would see him at the same time as my dad and my other sisters, and they're not as literary people. And so every time I got to see my uncle, it was this really great chance just to talk about books, and it kind of just felt like that was like our own secret language. There's this one time we were talking about Shakespeare, and my dad didn't know what time period Shakespeare was from, and he said, "Is he from the 1800s?" And my Uncle Ted was always very kind and was like, "Oh no, he's from this time period." But he gave me this like side look of like, "Oh my God, your dad thinks Shakespeare is from the 1800s?" And yeah, so he was just a big part of my life growing up, and a big inspiration for me. Yeah, so Johnny did it because he's a graphic designer, so it was easy for him. I was originally going to go with a different designer, but I asked Johnny to do like a mock-up for me, and even his mock-up, like, I loved it. And so I asked him to do the whole thing, and I wanted a picture of a woman on it. And we ended up going with this particular image because you can see her sort of looking in a mirror, and it was sort of like this, two different reflections of her in a way, and it felt like it sort of reflected the storyline. And I really wanted it to look like very 1920s, and I think that the like big bold yellow writing and the green background really says 1920s, the roaring 20s and Prohibition and all that. The back of my book is a picture of Vancouver in 1926, in like this exact like street basically that the book starts on. So that was a very exciting find to have on my book. So I'm going to have my book launch on June 27th, and it's going to be part book launch, part burlesque show, because yeah, my book is very much about burlesque. I'm going to have several performers, including Stella Gams and Lucy Caboose, who helped inspire one of my characters. And yeah, so it's going to start with me doing a reading, I guess. I still have to figure that out of what that'll be like. And then a show with acts that are sort of like 1920s or like classic burlesque. So yeah, and I'm going to perform as well. And I'm going to do a 1920s themed act. I thought like doing a regular book launch at the bookstore would be great, but I don't know. I just wanted to do something a bit crazier for it and have an excuse to dress like a flapper for the night. I've had a few people tell me that they would like a sequel to this book, which is really flattering, but I don't know that I will. Maybe, but it's not really high on my priority. I am working on a second book now, and I'm like close to done the first draft. And that one is definitely something I've been thinking about for a long time. It's based in 1958 in Vancouver, and sort of the backdrop is the amusement park in Vancouver, because that's where I grew up, and it's a huge part of growing up in the city. And so I wanted to write something that sort of lets me be a nerd and do the history around that. I have a lot of ideas for historical fiction, but I think at some point I would love to write like a gothic horror type story. That one was a lot quicker. I'm like not quite done it yet, but I think I've been steadily working on it for the last few months. But I've learned a lot since I've started writing that first one, and I've even taken like novel writing classes, so I'm so much more organized than I was. So I think this will be definitely less than like 9 years.